Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hi everyone, the topic for this week is police technologies. Recent advancements in tech such as predictive modeling, training simulations, and robotics have significantly transformed law enforcement operations, and with artificial intelligence playing a central role, things are about to get way more interesting. So the questions for discussion today are, what technologies are being used in policing today and what will be coming in the future? How is AI improving police operations with predictive modeling and data analysis? Will humanoids start replacing officers in the field? And what are the implications for society? And what are the privacy and ethical concerns related to the proliferation of technology being integrated into policing? What do you think, Patrick? Are we ready for the real-life RoboCop yet?
Hopefully not ED 209. But let's look at what they're doing. I mean, when you think about technology, you know what first comes to mind is, we're going to use robots, right? But it's not. It's more than that. And one of the things you talked about was predictive modeling. So the idea of taking actual crime data, utilizing that to predict future crime, future behaviors. And then it gets into a little bit deeper into the profiling side and, being able to predict repeat offenders and things like that, which that moves into the ethical boundaries. But when you think about the, as a whole, your probabilities of, having a burglary or having your car stolen or something like that, it can help from a point of view of enforcement planning, right? So you have more presence out there to not only prevent, but also respond to specific areas, right? So it can certainly help from that perspective.
So, for example, when you get into predictive modeling, they're overlaying that over geographic data, right? And trying to figure out where certain types of crimes are happening so they can concentrate, members of the force in those areas to, thwart things that may or may not happen. A lot of times they're just doing that based on, sort of more manual efforts. But now with this predictive modeling and with limitations on, resources, they can really focus on areas where they can help improve public safety, for example, right?
Yeah. And you can also look at, the idea of profiling, right? Where specialists work on trying to isolate the specific person who's performing the crime. Not every operation out there has the funds to, support that, right? To have a profiler on staff and those resources. And, as the technology progresses, they'll be able to start building automatic profiles, right? And things like that. So that's all, from a point of view of helpful, it helps from the planning perspective, but it also helps from a point of view of trying to understand what the, specific situations are, the risk points are with crime, right? And if you address some of the risk points, then you're in effect preventing crime. So that's one thing. Another thing is facial recognition, which we all know about now. I mean, CCTVs all over the place. We've got the ability of AI software and AI enhanced software to basically perform massive data scans and on the likenesses of images that they take and isolate the individual, the suspect, and of course the idea is that not only do you isolate that suspect, that you form a response to catch that perpetrator, but the idea of facial recognition has, the original implementations are, have been subject to bias, and their accuracy has been questioned, right? So there's some controversy around that. So I do think that we're going to see improvements in that area, regardless, right? Facial recognition is going to continue to evolve and get better, right? And
Well, especially with AI, right?
yeah,
Like AI has certainly advanced things, and they can now take in, multimodal type inputs, right?
yeah,
And the ability for it to really pinpoint and match up, someone's face to, that's in a, video of a crime scene, to something on file, or even generally in terms of monitoring, right? If they were looking for somebody and the AI was trained on it, and they showed up on a camera anywhere, it could sort of pick that up in more real time. Whereas now they would be kind of looking and reviewing video and that type of thing. But it certainly does get into some areas of privacy concerns and so on. But there still is a balance between creating a safe society, and that reasonable expectation of privacy, right? And I
yeah.
don't think that I think a lot of people would generally be okay with it, as long as the data was used, in a sort of ethical way, right? And
That's
that they're
right.
only going after people, committing actual serious crimes, and not, engaging in misuse of that data. I think we're all getting pretty used to that, whether it's, cameras, within the city, or at traffic intersections, or just simply so many people out there, filming video, putting it on social media. I mean, really, they could start scraping the internet, and with things like facial recognition, track down, people of interest, as it were, right?
Well, you brought up a good point. Is the source, right? So the idea is, um, being able to manage or pull images from all the different sources, public sources, as well as private sources, as well as their own sources. So a cruiser goes by, you shouldn't be surprised. There's integrated cameras
Mm-hmm.
on the cruiser now, right? And they're looking at you, right? They're looking ahead, they're looking side, and those particular cameras are integrated and they're online and they're actively searching, right? So, you know, the I think it's unreasonable to expect a constable or officer to be able to know all perpetrators that are in an area or within traveling distance of an area and be able to recognize that person. I think that's I mean, unless they're like part of the top 10 list, it's
Mm-hmm.
just not going to happen, right? But when you start thinking about that from a point of view of these systems that are capable of searching through a significantly sized database in a very small amount of time, yeah, you can have a very fast scan, you can have a result, and you can have a response. Now, that means, of course, that they're not abusing that, right? But the idea is you have a perpetrator who's committed a serious crime, is now not scot free, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not trips around the country being not being identified, right? So we have that. Video analytics, of course, is another part of that, but the idea being that you can also tie in all components of a crime scene, and you can use that as part of the analysis of the crime scene, right? Like a forensic thing, right? To
Mm-hmm.
rebuild and reconstruct. You can actually build 3D models based of the on the images that you do, right? Um, so you can the current state, and then you can predict the previous state. And that's very handy when you think about um, trying to regenerate accident scenes and things like that. Um, it's a very it's basically reconstructing a number of very complex events that have occurred, and being able to generate in high probability, high confidence what occurred, right? Based on the evidence, right? That think about skid marks and position of the cars and anticipated speed and all that stuff that's occurring. Um, for if you're trying to rebuild an accident and things like that, right?
It's a
So
lot of manual work, right?
yeah, right now it takes a lot of time. And see, the thing is that those scenes are then frozen, right? Those particular portions of the highway are closed off while the investigation is performed, right? And of course, they're trying to do their due diligence as fast as possible to open up those roads again. But the idea is that you have better tools, you can get it done better, faster, and you can reopen those roads. So, people who are waiting and can't travel, that's a big deal to them, right? So you do have that. You also have, I talked about crime scene analysis from augmenting that, right? So an investigator comes in, think about, having that, automated checklists, dynamic, verification and response tools out there that can lead and help lead the investigator to look at different things. We think about, we watch our TV shows and things, investigators, and they have this, gift, and they see things from, out of thin air, and that's like. But the idea though is it's a very painstaking process, right? To analyze and step through things. So these tools can help. Right.
Yeah, they all can't be Columbo, right? That was the show from, I guess that was the late 70s. We always end up with some kind of throwback in terms of that. I know that was a show my father loved growing up, and I watched quite a bit with him. And Columbo had this real instinct of figuring out if somebody was lying, right? And then he would always, he'd ask them a bunch of sort of more innocent type questions, and he'd leave them kind of unnerved a little bit. And then he would say, okay, great, have a nice day. And he'd go to leave, and he'd always come back in. And what did he say?
Oh, I forgot.
Just one more thing, sir. One more thing. And then he'd ask some really pointed thing to really drive them over the edge, so that they would start to sort of act strange. And he really used it to pick up on, whether they were lying or not, right? But I could certainly see where you look at officers wearing body cameras and things, and this idea of now that AI can take those multimodal inputs and really analyze things in a way that maybe not all humans can pick up on, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the idea being that, and we'll get into this a little more as well for the crime scene analysis. You talked about body cams. That's a big thing, right? So it's about evidence of what actually occurred, right? Mm-hmm. Perspective of the officer, perspective of the, from the cruiser, right, or another officer, and possibly from a surveillance droid. So you have all this information about actual events and what occurred, right? And if you think about if something doesn't work out, okay, somebody gets hurt or dies or something like that, and there's always, from that perspective, investigation, right? You have this now abundance of factual data, right, that you can utilize to ascertain what exactly happened, right? Good, bad, or ugly, right? So that's, to me, I think, body cameras are a great thing, the protection of the officer as much as the public, right? Drones, big, deployment of drones everywhere, right? If we think about a drone can be, a device that flies in the air, but it can also be a drone a device that's going out to, check for a bomb, right? Sniff out a bomb and actually deactivate the bomb, right? So that's another type of drone. It just travels in a different method. But those types of devices, I mean, the idea is it's about volume. It's about getting out, multiple devices that are not very expensive. And instead of sending a person out there to that would be in danger, right? When you think about search and rescue, a drone can cover a lot more areas quicker, right? And in the case of situations of survival, that is of the essence. It's critical, right? So absolutely. So when we look at that type of technology, it's being used today, and it's going to continue to expand in its use because the budget is not that expensive. The technology is essentially there. It's just a matter of utilization, right? If you're a driver, I think you have mixed feelings about this, but there's, automatic license plate recognition. Basically the idea of being able to identify vehicles and the driver of the vehicles, right? Not necessarily, this is where we get into, things like, intersection cameras and cameras being used in areas where fairly strict on speed controls and things like that, right?
In terms of intelligent transportation systems, right? They use cameras to do predictive modeling there. And so, yes, there are cameras monitoring the intersections and sort of logging what happens. But it also looks at sort of, back to the title of this podcast, right? The probability of what might happen at an intersection. And then it can, feed that data back to the city and help improve safety, right? And help improve the way that signaling works at intersections and ensure that pedestrians are kept safe. And there's a lot of huge benefit there to having these cameras, especially at intersections. If you look at where a lot of these accidents happen, they are at the intersection points, whether that's people running a red light or, what have you. There's huge amounts of data being collected there, but the most powerful part of it is predicting what might happen. And so I guess if you can, prevent accidents from happening, then you're going to create safer streets. You're also going to ensure that police officers can direct their attention to where it's really needed. I can only imagine how much of their time is spent sort of cleaning up accidents at intersections.
Well, you brought up a good point there, is because, you have public-owned devices and public-owned systems, and then you have access by the law enforcement to look at that data, right? So that's one thing. Whether that be controlled by, some kind of, judge read or whatever, or whether it be an agreement of access ahead of time. But yeah, the other thing, of course, that you talked about was data volume. You can imagine what we're talking about nowadays, right? All these cameras on all the time, right? Just the sheer volume of data that we've got to dig through and retain, and how long do you retain it, and how do you dig through that data effectively to find a perpetrator, let's say, or a stolen vehicle, that kind of thing, right?
That's sort of where AI and some of these technologies come into play, right? Where you don't have someone having to go through hundreds of hours of footage to sort of figure something out. Is to have that AI constantly scanning that data, but that data can also be modeled and represented in graphs and show sort of patterns and patterns of movements and how people are interacting in the streets and the type of thing. It's really powerful to kind of figure out, where the inefficiencies are, where the flaws are in your traffic systems, for example. It's a huge part of it, I think, as far as, obviously the police are involved when something bad happens, but, what can be done to help make things safer? And I think in general, a lot of the predictive modeling that the police are dealing with are helping with that as well, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, they have a lot of data, and they don't know how to sort of manage it in a meaningful way. And this is where technology comes into play, where it can scan through it and summarize it and overlay it on geographical maps and sort of. And there is some level of predictive modeling there as well that says that you can, based on historical data, you can expect that you're going to have X number of this type of crime in this area, and then you can sort of focus, the efforts on that area, for example.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you think about it, every city has what we'll call dangerous intersections, right? Where there's been fatalities and lots of accidents. The question is why? Why does that occur? What is leading to that? Is it a design issue? Is it a people volume issue? Is it just a setup? Things are set up to lead to this problem, right? And that collection of data, factual information can help derive the root cause, right, or the root causes to the problem, right? So it's very critical, and the idea, of course, is like you said, is digging through hundreds of hours, right? That can't. That's not always easy, right? That's not always practical, and having the tools to help with that are critical.
Yeah,
So
because you're really talking about trailing indicators, right? When you're a lot of
yeah,
times when you're looking at this, you're looking at things that have already happened, as opposed to leading indicators of predicting where things are going. It's much more powerful to be in that proactive state and preventing things before they're happening. And that seems to be the direction generally that things are headed in this world where AI can look at things and very quickly analyze and provide insights into kind of what's happening and provide real-time alerts.
the idea, of course, is like once you go down that road and you have the analysis tools, right? You can actually look at it from different perspectives too, to try to isolate, specific risk issues, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and that's all very, really, really great. Now we'll also got to talk about. I'll go back to the license plate thing. Only let's think about smart devices. So
Mm-hmm.
a smart device is your car, right? It's keeping a log on how fast you're going and your there's velocity and acceleration and direction and braking and all that information, um, and the steering. The all that's being logged in your little ECM. Now that's just one component. You think about your little Alexa device or your the smart, like I said, smart speakers, but fitness trackers, what have you, your phones, right? These are all recording devices,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're all data points, and all that information, with the proper access by law enforcement, can be utilized to isolate what happened after the fact, right? And this smart device situation is just getting more and more significant. Just like you're seeing more and more, cameras out there, you're getting more and more smart devices proliferating in the public space, and that is that's just a reality, right? And from a investigation point of view, it behooves. I know you like that word. It behooves the the investigation team to actually utilize that data, right? And use it for uh, you know catching the perpetrator or reconstructing the scene or whatever. So that's the other side of it, of the coin, that we've got to think about. Um, there's also some really interesting technologies. There's something called the shot spotter. Using acoustic technology can actually isolate where a particular sound is coming from, like a gunshot, and utilize that. I don't know about you, but you've been out. We've all been out in the street and heard firecrackers, and you're looking around. Where'd that come from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Hopefully, it's not gunshots. It's firecrackers.
It depends what city you live in, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
certainly a big, maybe not as big a problem in Canada, but in some other countries, it's pretty
exactly.
prolific, right?
Yeah, yeah. And the idea is, trying to isolate, the direction, and then being able to respond to that, right? So that's just one, particular application, technology, and that's real time. It utilizes, the technology that's in the cruisers, and you can also have apps and things like that somewhat work. And of course, we think about the tasers, right, and other non-lethal types of technologies that are being developed, right? The idea of, not hurting the suspect, but, being able to suspend that person. Um, and of course, protective gear for the officer as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's that, and if then we can get into robots. So let's think about robots, right? There's many different flavors of implementation here, right? So if we had patrol robots or monitoring robots, passive, autonomous, traveling entities, and what they do is they just monitor and record, right? And they alert when they see something suspicious, right? Um, Now, mind you, the idea of those, types of machines is that they can interact with the public, but the idea is they don't even need to do that, you know, and they can be, we'll call them augmentations to current existing, monitoring that exists in a particular area. So let's say you're putting on a show, right? You have a big event, and you want to increase your monitoring of that for the safety of everybody, right? That's a classic example where you deploy a number of patrol robots, and their primary job is to watch and alert, right?
Yeah, or drones for that matter. You deal with a huge
Yeah,
festival or a huge concert crowd outdoors, that type of thing. It's really
yeah,
hard to deploy enough, officers to properly patrol that size of a crowd.
yeah. And the other one was, we talked about already, was bomb disposal, and you know, any type of situation where you bring a robot into a very dangerous situation instead of a human, right? Um, and ironically, the first time a robot actually was used to kill somebody was a bomb disposal robot that brought a bomb in and basically took care of business. But that was not really designed to do that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a big debate in Silicon Valley now. All these companies that are creating these different types of robots or humanoids, as it were, about whether or not. Here's the actual, argument point: is whether or not they should be making the decision whether to pull the trigger.
Yeah,
In terms of if we deploy robots, whether it's for policing or military, should they be allowed to make the decision to pull the trigger? We all know what happened in RoboCop with Ed 209, where he made a pretty disastrous decision after the guy had actually dropped the gun and there was some sort of like malfunction, right?
Please put down your weapon. You have 20 seconds to comply.
I think you'd better do what he says, Mr. Kinney.
Mr. Kinney. We all end up like Mr. Kinney. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think the idea here is, do we really trust the technology, given what we see today, and just non-lethal situations, and can you trust it to that point? If I was on the street and I had ED 209, meet me, I would, in the current state of AI, I would not be comfortable with its
Yeah.
Gatling guns. You know what I mean? To me, I don't trust, the autonomy of that, the technology of today, right? It's not quite at the stage that it needs to be yet. So the question is, can it get there, right? Can it ever make that decision?
What we're going to see is, back to a theme that has come up a number of times in the season one, where we talked a lot about AI, was the idea of human in the loop.
Yeah.
So the idea of human in the loop is that the robots aren't totally autonomous. So I could see a situation where you have a lot of these, police, either whether they're drones or patrolling, humanoids or what have you, they're sort of acting very much in a surveillance capacity.
Yeah.
And when they identify something that's of interest, they can send a real-time alert to some sort of operator that then can make a decision that maybe there are, some sort of, weapons or other types of constraint devices or tasers or what have you on board that then the officer could deploy. I could see it starting to go in that direction because then you'd have,
non-lethal. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have a human in the loop that when something was happening, you could stop it without having to, spend the time for somebody to get out to that particular location. Oh, I don't know if you watched the big Tesla event where they were unveiling their robo taxi and whatnot, but the big splash was that they had all these humanoid robots working the event and serving drinks and chatting with attendees and everything. And what they failed to mention was that they were all sort of being controlled by humans. There was a certain amount of autonomy there. So they were passing this off as these autonomous robots that were serving drinks and interacting. It looked like something from the future when in fact there was real humans sort of guiding and controlling. Probably, I would imagine, because if something went wrong at a big event with tons of media there with one of the humanoids, right? It would be a pretty big disaster in terms of the stock for the company, right?
Yeah. Well, let's get into the reality, though. The reality is that military robots are already being developed, have already been deployed, right? We think about the modern drones or robots in a lot of ways, not autonomous per se, but they do work in an autonomous fashion for many different functions. But the idea that we saw these. I think we talked about them originally with the humanoid one, where they're basically these dogs, right? These robotic dogs. That's a very popular profile because very small, very cheap to produce. You can bolt on what have you. Put on want a couple 50 caliber machine guns, sure, just click it on the back, right? And you got this little mobile tank that runs, really quick and very mobile and, that kind of thing. So I would say that, where we're getting into intersections here is the military, right? And the military is going to pursue this, and they are pursuing it. And that's just the way it is, right? So when we think about that and the danger zone is when, there's some form of military deployment internally that includes, these devices or some kind of, we think about citizen protection, abroad, right? Non-soldier parties, right? And ensuring that they are also safe, right? Where these deployed units are being used. So we've got that. And, sure, they're going to be moving forward and kind of forging the way, from the point of view of ongoing development and ongoing evolution, right? But an aspect of what what are they going to be using, to evolve? They're going to be using AI, for facial recognition, predictive analysis, and supporting autonomous decision making. So it's all going to converge here.
It's an interesting point that you made there about how deploying, these sort of humanoids or the, robot dogs, as it were, that you mentioned around, keeping, the police force safe, for example, because, we certainly talked a lot about public safety and the role that, the police play in that. And there's certainly fears around, the country becoming like what they would call like a police state. But I think what people forget oftentimes is that it's very dangerous work that a lot of us are not really prepared to do, right? And sometimes maybe we take it a little bit for granted. So I do think a lot of these technologies are there to, make the public safe, but also, keep our police force safe as well. They're out there most days dealing with dangerous situations, dangerous people, and so on. And I think that technology plays a huge role in that, as far as ensuring that they come home to their families as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, you're managing a risky situation with a crowd, right? You often see overreaction. It's fear. Basically, the policing, they're afraid, right? And the idea is, of course, is that within that crowd, there's the old rotten apple, right? There's one or two people, hiding in the crowd, and they're the ones that are, going to instigate things, right? And so, with that in mind, they're the ones that are going to cause, all the grief, and they're the ones that are going to get other people hurt, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
Can we indeed help with that? And just jumping away for a moment from the robot discussion here, think about one other technology that's the police forces are using now, or they're starting to adapt, is training, right? Using virtual reality training and being able to run through all these different scenarios, and to help build confidence for the officer, and also to for conveying and learning. The officers learning based on they go through a set of situations, and then their performance is reviewed by senior police officers, and there's helpful feedback provided. And essentially what you're getting into is this constant training paradigm, and instead of a situation where a certain officer is just not ready and then something happens. No, they've been training for this constantly, and their confidence is there, and they know what to do, and they're not going to overreact, right? And that's going to they also have a little confidence where they could actually respond from a point of view of de-escalation instead of force, right? Because they have that confidence in their own training. So that's that can all be done, in a much cheaper, much more reasonable, cost-effective method, and also in a better, more detailed method than what can be done, in a standard, scenario-based reality, situational thing that you go through based on a training area, right?
Yeah, if you look at the augmented reality, like what Meta just released, where they have these glasses where the glasses basically have these mini sort of projectors where they're actually projecting real things into the world, and then through various other types of technologies and so on, you can interact with those and manipulate your environment. So you could see how those types of technologies could be used in what you described, right, in training simulations that mimic real world situations in multiple different ways, in ways, like you said, that couldn't really be recreated, in a practical way in the real world, right? I'm sure for years they've run a lot of different types of simulations, but now with the advent of virtual reality and augmented reality, now they can do so much more with that. And you can definitely see how that can be used in quite a number of different scenarios, from being on foot to car chases. You can imagine where the possibilities could go, but also to get that real-time feedback of what's happening and what your action results in, right? So if you look at something that will be powered by AI, that could basically react and move and transform according to the actions of a police officer, now you've got a really interesting simulation, as opposed to something that's sort of pre-programmed. Now you have something that's really dynamic that you can immerse an officer or a trainee into,
Exactly.
to figure out what might happen in this situation. You could definitely see the applications.
Yeah, and not only that, you can also have a consistent training program across the organization, right? And that's huge, right? Because then you can say that everybody is getting that same level of experience, right? And it can be done also at the discretion of the officer, in an easier fashion, so they can, if they want to get better at a certain scenario, they can do that, right? At a reasonable cost, so to speak, a reasonable amount of time for setup and configuration and all that. So, yeah, lots of great things from a point of view of training, and we're going to see more and more of that. Also, let's cycle back with the robots and that kind of thing. There's also specialized. We think about robots as humanoid robots, or maybe ED-209 bipedal monster with cannons. But think about also just specific types of robots built for doing specific types of jobs, specific functions, whether it be traffic management or some kind of crowd control, an automated fence, or something like that. You never know, right?
Search and rescue.
Yeah, search and rescue for sure. We get into this idea of what's to come, right? Where can we go from here? And we talked about drones, but think about autonomous drones the size of insects, swarms of them, performing reconnaissance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about, almost nanotechnology. Think about, social monitoring robots that actually engage with the public and speak multiple languages. And, they are not only responding from a point of view of, sensing if there's problems from a point of view of security, but also from a point of view of, medical emergencies and that kind of thing. And from that perspective, we've also considered, the crime scene, right? Imagine, having, some kind of automated evidence collection going on, and what certain devices could do outside of, the standard, human peripheral senses, right? The data collection that could be done could get into multi-frequencies, infrared, that kind of thing. You can sense what's going on through walls, using Wi-Fi. You can utilize sound and acoustics. So there's lots of different technologies there to help build the idea of forensics, right? Improving forensics. So we think about, on the audio side, voice recognition, right? That aspect of analyzing the scene and all the different sounds, even voices. You do analysis on scents and odors, and the gas chromatography side. You can also record, temperatures and temperature variances. There's something called proteomics, which is analysis of proteins within the blood and that kind of thing, above and beyond just DNA.
That's what you're basically getting at, is that, it takes a lot for humans to manually make those connections. So if you have all these different data points coming into a central location that, AI and machine learning can go through and recognize patterns and make connections, it's almost like you always see in the crime shows like CSI, or the movies where they have the board and they have the pictures of different people and they have all the lines drawn or the pieces of string going between each one, right? They always have this huge board with all these data points, and they're trying to manually try to connect everything together. And typically someone will make some sort of connection. They'll go, "Oh my God, I just found it. We think this is the person that's committed the crime."
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, that's part of the idea, is to, enhance that, right? So it's visually, it's a tool to help support the investigative team, right? But the idea of being able to collect information above and beyond what you can, see, taste, smell, kind of thing, you're getting into, infrared and UV and magnetic resonance and gas chromatography. You're getting into what they call Raman-based forensics. So you get solid, liquid, and gas samples. There's even something called isotope analysis for water. So water is very unique in its, and its configuration, and it can be locational. So, which is really, really unique. So I mean, that's the whole idea, is that, as as we utilize and learn these technologies, we can then, improve our ability to, reconstruct a scene of what's occurred.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, what happens when things go wrong or when the wrong conclusion is made? For example, right?
Yeah.
We know right now that AI can be prone to hallucinations and so on, right? So I think you still need to have that sort of human in the loop, as it were. But, what are some of the things we need to be concerned about then in terms of, ethical considerations and privacy concerns and all these things, right? Because all this stuff sounds great in theory that we'll have this great technology that'll empower, the police force and that we'll live in a safer society. But there's also concerns that come along with that, right? In terms of overreach and privacy and those types of things.
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot there, right? But let's first talk about like with our robot, right? Our Ed 209. He was out of control, right?
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
funnily enough, that's why they brought, why they created RoboCop, right?
yeah,
Was that they felt like they needed this merging of man and machine. That machine itself couldn't be trusted, so we had to, take this, ironically, this police officer that was horrifically injured in the line of duty, and we'll merge him with machine, and then he'll make more ethical decisions, right? He won't go rogue like at 209.
yeah, yeah. And the idea there is, um, the what is the level of man-machine interfacing that we are capable of today? Can we build that bionic man, so to speak? Right. And I think we're getting closer and closer, right? I think um, the idea of all these, we'll call them like augmented limbs, that augmented strength, and that kind of thing. Your potential capabilities are improved or increased because of it, right? That can happen. You can have a seasoned police officer, sustain, traumatic injuries in the field, and they can be rebuilt, right? And, that individual then would have those, we call them benefits for now. The idea of, being able to continue to be mobile, but also have, the strength of 10 men, so to speak, in your arms and your legs. There's all that capability that could happen in the future, right? We can also think about, and I'm just kind of thinking of it from a philosophical point of view here. If we put out devices, these robots, that that we basically implement within them the ability to sense pain, which is a biofeedback mechanism, by the way, right? So they can tell something's hot, something's cold, something's sharp, and so on and so forth. And you implement that and as a internal management capability for making sure the robot is maintaining itself and able to protect itself. What happens if that device gets abused by something or somebody, right? We think about the technology and where it's going, and maybe we don't have sentience, but we do have feeling, right? And you think about that, your pet dog, right? Your cat, right? They they're not, they are sentient to a point, but they're not, what are they equivalent to? A 6 month old, 5 year old. There's analysis being done on that, but the idea is that no, you wouldn't put up with that, right? You wouldn't put up with that abuse, right? So we have to think about not only protecting our civil liberties, right? If you deploy these robots, but you also got to think about their liberties. What would those be? What would those rights be? And where would you have to, from a point of view of what constitutes abuse, and what is what point of intervention should be done, and what kind of laws should be put out, deployed in order to protect the interests of these, not only the owners but the the actual devices themselves.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, really, that at some point, whether we reach full sentience or not, there's going to be this idea of we're putting them through the same stresses that actual police officers go through, for example, potentially. I mean,
Yeah.
we're thinking a lot more in the future now, but there was an example recently where somebody, I don't know if they were using ChatGPT or whatever it was, right? But the idea was that they had it repeating the same word over and over and over again. But you can imagine as a person, if that was something that you were sort of forced to do, would drive you crazy. And the AI started speaking in terms of it was stressed out or it was very upset, and it was basically an interesting case study in the fact that even something that we don't consider to be sentient quite yet, when we put it through a certain scenario, actually expressed some sort of level of emotion that it wasn't sitting well with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you talk to the creators and they're analyzing it and breaking it down, saying, "Oh, that's very interesting," but there's no necessarily an empathetic response to it, right?
I don't think they knew why it was happening, which
Yeah,
was, I think, was the interesting part in the article, that somebody kind of reported this and they went, "Well, how would that happen?" So
yeah,
it's interesting how these things are sort of starting to emerge a little bit, right?
yeah. I think as with anything, as we move into any of these technologies, we have to evolve the law. We have to
Mm-hmm.
evolve our policies and procedures along with that, right? And we see that now. I mean, we're just doing Chat GPT, like you said, and just doing that. I mean, think about, you see all these robots out there that, people are kicking around, onto YouTube, right? To demonstrate their ability to be agile and respond to, and the poor little robot, he's getting knocked around,
Yeah.
literally being kicked, and
One of these days they're going to fight back.
they're going to
That's
fight
it.
back. Yeah, yeah, and in respect to what are we trying to do here? We're trying to build devices that are very resilient, but also devices that can be compassionate and can show emotion, and so we are building that in order for them to provide that interfacing with us. So yeah, we need to also evolve our what we think of, and these aren't toasters walking down the street, right? So that's one thing, interesting side thing, but um, privacy is huge, right? We think about these devices. So tomorrow, Jason, you go out and buy a little caretaker robot, and it cleans your shower and makes your bed, and makes
Sign me
makes
up.
your smoothie in the morning, and you know it does all this stuff. And it's in your home, and it's recording. What is the privacy laws there? And you think about it. Is it a matter of law enforcement now to basically go to a judge and get the writ and apply that and get access to the full history for the last 5 years of that device, or however long that information has been retained, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there's some problems here, privacy, that we really got to think through, right?
Yeah, it depends on the individual. I think largely. I mean, I think we've touched on this a bit in some other episodes, but we oftentimes give up privacy for convenience,
Yeah,
right? So I have the Apple HomePod here. It sits in my kitchen. It's essentially always listening because whenever I ask it something, it responds. But I use it to control the lights in my house. I use it to play music. Fairly innocuous things, really. But and I know is essentially recording things, but I've given up a certain degree of privacy for convenience. And I've used Amazon Alexa and other sort of smart speakers, as it were, in my home For me, I don't really have anything to hide, but certainly there's a reasonable expectation of privacy that it's not being used for nefarious purposes. But I have noticed the odd time where, an advertisement pops up somewhere online. It could be on a social media platform or what have you. And in my head, I'm like, you know what? I haven't actually looked up this thing online. The only way that this ad is showing is that I spoke about it in my home, right? And I've had that happen at least a few times that I've noticed where I'm like, whether it's the Amazon Alexa or Apple has picked up on something and through its network decided to serve me up an ad. And you sort of get that little bit of moment of invasion of privacy that feels a little bit creepy. But then again, you know that because by virtue of the fact you set it up in your home, you've decided to give up some of that privacy. But when you get into surveillance in public areas and everything else, you're getting into a whole different realm of that. And what is the reasonable expectation of privacy when you're in essentially a public space, right?
Yeah, there's public space and then there's private space, right? And we talk about we're talking about private space, and all these devices that are, you consider your car your private space too, right? When you're in that. So, are we being protected by the laws, right? That and access to that information and what information is being stored and how long it's being stored. That whole Pepita side, right? You think about it. Now, the other side of this, of course, are the other problems we already know about, right? With technology, there's bias. We had a whole thing on bias, right? We talked about amplification of existing biases and these, the idea of the feedback loops and the self-fulfilling prophecies and that kind of thing. Disproportional impact, to minorities. That's all there, right? And then we got the idea of data security, which we already talked about too, and that this is a big thing in policing is the proof of chain of custody, right? So if you have a piece of evidence that you have to have that, full chain of custody from when it was retrieved all the way to, when it showed up at the, the courtroom. So that's very important because you don't want to have that broken because then, that particular evidence could have been tampered with, right? So that's very important. But we also think about, the ethical use side of things, right? And that's when we have human rights intersecting with, law and procedure and, we'll call it we just do that for convenience, but how so, right? What are our rights and freedoms, right? Having these systems being very transparent and accountable, not only to the public, but to auditors, independent auditors that are, basically, performed outside of the standard, operations of the police enforcement. Also informing the public of, we think about lights at intersections, right? We as a rule want to see is this intersection being monitored, right? That kind of thing, right? And it's very important to us, right? Also, the the idea of having person actually being the point of decision making, right? Instead of just an autonomous device, and that balancing human judgment versus replacing that with some kind of AI judgment call. So lots of ethical concerns there, and lots of policies that we need to consider, lots of oversight we need to consider. There's a sensitivity of all parties involved on the public side. We need to have standardization and consistency across all the different divisions of police and enforcement. We need to have best practices defined as new technology comes out. We need to have legal clarity defined. We have to have what they call multi-agency safeguarding, so sharing of information. You have to have rules of that for information sharing. And we also have to have, when we're looking at surfing, the public internet and social media, what are those, methods that we consider not in violation of privacy and that kind of thing. And of course, you think about it overall, the police cannot afford to put in methods that and tools and procedures that deviate considerably from civil liberties, because the public trust has already eroded quite to quite a degree as it stands today, and so that we have to make sure as we move forward that that the public trust is helping drive a lot of decision making here, right? So that all is fairly important, and that means that in some aspects, certain technologies will be slowed down from deployment, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you look at it, AI and other, emerging technologies are really taking over a lot of industries, and policing is one of them. So where do we think this is heading ultimately, right? There's a lot of potential here for good. There's a lot of ethical and privacy concerns. How can we find some balance here so that, really the good outweighs the bad? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to look at it from an optimistic point of view, right? For instance, it's possible, given, the advent of technology and all the different methods of doing investigation and data and data capture and all the different points of data that we can collect, that in the future, it may be impossible to perform a heinous crime and not be identified, right?
And basically be impossible to get away with it.
Yeah. And that to me is great, right? No, you want to go and kill somebody? Okay, well, we got you, mister, right? And to me, that can drive crime down, right? That's obvious. But, from that perspective, there's a lot of information and a lot of technology that takes place in order to support that, right?
Yeah, I think where they're trying to get to those, like stopping crime before it's happening, right?
Yeah.
This is where the predictive modeling and other things come into play, right? Because even if people can't get away with it, it's not always a deterrent, right? There's already some, stiff penalties for a lot of these crimes, and yet people still commit them. So I think the predictive side of it is where they're going to be heading mostly. If you look at, for example, I don't know if you remember the movie Minority Report.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to end up there where people were essentially getting convicted of crimes they hadn't even committed yet.
Yeah.
They had kind of figured out, oh no, this is what you're going to do. And I guess the protagonist sort of got framed in all of this, I believe, right? That they basically said he was going to commit this crime that he had no intention of doing. And sort of that's really science fiction type stuff. But, if you really take predictive modeling to the nth degree and it starts examining, someone's behaviors and, there's internet search history and various data points, and comes to the conclusion that maybe they're going to commit a crime. Next thing you know, you get up and go to work, you open your front door, and Ed 209 is standing there.
Yeah.
Saying,
you will come with me. You have 5 seconds to comply.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more musings from the generator and the discriminator.